This is Behind the Mic with Kirkus Reviews, where the subject is audiobooks. I'm Joe Reed. Today, a special show. Lauren Groff joins us. She's a remarkable writer, and it turns out, an excellent narrator of her own work. In fact, she's an Earphones Award winner. Lauren is the author of novels like Fates and Furies, Matrix, and The Vaster Wilds. But as she'll tell you, she returns again and again to the short story. In her recently published collection, Brawler, the stories move through family, love, and the way pain travels across generations. And because she narrates the book herself, you'll actually hear the stories in the voice that shaped them. I love talking to Lauren and hope you like listening to our conversation. Here we go. Lauren, first of all, thank you for doing this. A big thank you for this collection, Brawler. My God, it's a remarkable group of stories. And you also chose to narrate the audiobook yourself.
I did. Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. But before we talk about the recording process, I'm so curious, when you look at the stories in Brawler together, what to you feels like the beating heart of this collection?
I was thinking a lot over the course of the many years it took to write this collection about violence within the family unit. And sometimes it's a very subtle violence, right? It doesn't actually have to be hurting one another physically. But I think the family that we're born into is often fraught, right? That's a very mild way to put it. And we often hurt one another without meaning to, because anywhere there's love, there's the potential for pain. So that's something larger that I was thinking of when I went into putting this collection together.
A collection isn't just a gathering of stories, it's an act of selection and arrangement. As you chose which stories were going to be a part of Brawler, were you thinking about the kinds of questions you wanted the stories to pose to each other?
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of theories about short story collections because that is my primary form of reading delight, other than books of poetry and, often many novels. But I love a story collection. And so some of the philosophies I go by when building my own is having multiple overarching ideas and questions. But I think the first story has to ask a specific question, right? A sort of almost philosophical question that with each subsequent story gets changed a little bit, tweaked a little bit, splintered into parts, which are taken up by other stories later, until the final story, which I like to see as not a culmination in any way in the case of an ending, but almost a way to shine light outward and then back into the rest of the story collection, right? It's almost a reciprocal forward and backward prism, the last story. So I build my short story collections actually quite carefully in order to modify this whatever the initial question is being asked. I also build them with attention to texture, right? You don't want two very tiny short stories right next to one another or two very long stories next to one another. You want the first person stories to be sort of interspersed as opposed to just all of them all at the same time, right? So there are lots of things you want to think about when creating a collection as a whole.
Well, the book is bookended by two first-person short stories, and that had to be deliberate, I'm assuming, on your part.
Oh, it's deeply deliberate. Yes, thank you for noticing that. I am such a first person skeptic, right? But I do find myself using it once in a while when the third person, which is, my preferred mode, isn't sufficient. And it's, for me, a question of closeness, the titration of closeness, right? In the first person, you are anchored to an individual, even though you can sort of move through time relatively quickly. That individual consciousness is in the front. And I did want this to feel as though it were a collection told by a single person, but ranging, right, over time, space, place, right, character. So having those two first person beginning and ending, almost bookends, right, for the story collection, felt as though everything within the collection I'm thinking of it almost like a small saucepan that's making everything inside boil.
Well, you chose to open the book with The Wind, which centers on a woman, the grandmother of the narrator, who is trying to escape with her 3 children from an abusive husband who's also a cop.
They were so far out in the country, the bus came for them first, and the ride to town was long. At last it showed itself, yellow as sunrise, at the end of the road. Its slowness as it pulled up was agonizing. My mother's heart began to beat fast. She let her brothers get on before her and told them to sit in the front seats. Mrs. Palmer, the driver, was a stout lady who played the organ at church and whose voice, when she shouted at the naughty boys in the back, was high like soprano singing. She looked at my mother as she shut the bus door, then said in her sing-song voice, "You got yourself a shiner there, Michelle." The bus hissed up from its crouch and lumbered off. "I know," my mother said. "Listen, we need your help." And when Mrs. Palmer considered her, then nodded, my mother asked quickly if she could please drop the 3 of them off when she picked up the Yoder kids. Their mother would be waiting there for them. "Please," she said quietly.
That story was a knife to the heart. So how did it set the table for the collection?
So that story, believe it or not, it took me almost 30 years to write. The first draft I ever wrote of it was when I was a teenager, as a 19 or so, somewhere around there. And it took me many, many, many drafts through the decades to try to understand what it is that I wanted to think about and talk about. I mean, there are some family issues embedded in it that, I had to be very sensitive to and courageous enough in some ways to tackle. So that story, on the surface, it seems like a very simple story, but it's also one in which I wanted to think through sort of the epigenetics of family violence in a very real way, in the way that it sort of lives within the inheritors of it, even if they weren't there, right? The stories stay, the pain stays in the way that it is passed on from person to person and primarily woman to woman. But, the way that we all live with our mothers and grandmothers and foremothers, their life experiences, and the way that they manifest in our own lives. I mean, this is something that's really important, I think. And I'm not sure that I had written about it up until that point that I realized, that's what this story is about.
A reviewer in the New York Times wrote about your story, "What's the Time, Mr. Wolf?" that it feels destined to become a classic. And it was a knockout of a story. It follows Chip from a childhood Independence Day gathering with his WASP banking family all the way into adulthood. I'm curious, what drew you to telling a story of Chip's life?
Well, that is another story that took me a couple of decades to be able to write. And my first draft was in my mid-20s, and I just wasn't able to do it. For some stories, they come out of a collision for me of place and characters that slowly grow and feelings. And I grew up in a really beautiful family, and my family, I love them so much. We're definitely middle class. And then I went to Amherst College, and then I was suddenly surrounded with people from a vastly different social class, right? I thought we were doing well, and then there are people with trust funds everywhere. So in some ways, I've been fascinated in class in America as a really subtle thing that Henry James is a foundational writer for me. So is Edith Wharton, right? But I actually think that most of us write about class in one way or another. And so I really, really wanted to think about privilege, particularly the privilege of the mediocre white man, which we are currently in the process politically of being hurt by on a daily basis. So there's a lot of thinking through that and thinking through sort of the casual use of alcohol as social lubricant and boredom vanquisher, right? And the way that the expectations sometimes outshone what people are capable of doing. And I also wanted to think about someone who you don't actually hate, but who does something that nobody could ever justify, right? Because I think a lot of times when we all do bad things, we can almost always find a justification for them, even if they're really, really horrible. And part of the grace of becoming a better person is understanding that some things that we do are not justifiable.
And some people have lives that give them infinite amount of forgiveness.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
others get none.
None, exactly. And that's profound injustice, and it's baked into the very beginnings of this country, of course.
When he heard her voice, Chip started crying. He turned his back on the clerk, on the store with its buzzing lights and groaning refrigerators, the headlines grim about the snowstorm on the horizon. He put his head in the crook of his elbow and whispered, "Libby." "Chippy?" she said. "What the hell? What's going on?" But he couldn't tell her. To tell her would be to see the last of his sister's good opinion vanish forever. So he struggled to stop sobbing, to breathe. By the time he controlled himself, his sister had controlled herself too. "Whatever it is, it's really bad, huh?" his sister said coolly. "Yes," he said. "Okay," she said. "Here's the plan. I'll be there as soon as I can. Listen, can you just hunker down? Can you just make it to the end of the day?"
Well, as I mentioned, you narrated the audiobook of Brawler. So how was narrating this story for you? It's a long story with many characters.
Yeah, this is only my second time ever narrating one of my books, and I love doing it. I do it for the New Yorker every time I have a story in there. I think it's so much fun. I had a much harder time with Florida, which is the other book that I narrated, another short story collection. My short stories feel written on my soul, so I don't know if I would want someone else to do it. With Florida, it was really, really hard because the first 4 days I thought went swimmingly, and I lost my voice on day 4, and then I was told that my stomach was rumbling the whole way through, so I had to reread them, which is so embarrassing. But I reread them with a raspy throat and a pillow pressed to my midsection. This time it was glorious. Sarah came down. Sarah Jaffe, my producer and the director of this, came down, and we had these amazing 4 days in a really beautiful studio here in Gainesville, and I just loved it. And this particular story, it did take a really long time, but we decided to do it pretty close to the beginning, so I still had a voice the whole way through.
Well, first of all, let me say congratulations. You won an Earphones Award for both Brawler and for Florida.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, you are an award-winning narrator here.
I am. That's so nice.
I'm wondering if reading the stories aloud in the recording studio changed the way you understood them, maybe in their character or in the rhythms that you create or their musicality.
Well, that's not the first time I ever read my stories aloud. I read them aloud a lot in the editing phases, just because you really have to put the words into the air in order to understand what it is that you're doing. That said, maybe this will be a line of hope for all the writers who are listening to this. But every time I read anything of mine aloud, I want to read it with a pencil to make changes, right? Because nothing is truly finished. Nothing is truly static. You can always change something this way or that way, just a little bit to make it a little bit better. But I think that's some of the beauty of putting a book into the world. It's this gorgeous, almost moving picture of who you were in the years that you wrote the book. The you that wrote it is not this one static person, but it's a layered you that came back over and over and over again to put the book into the world. And so it's a very wise figure because it's not just you, it's you multiplied, right? It's you over the years. So I really love reading aloud because I always find things that I would do differently. And that's a wonderful thing as a writer, to be humbled over and over again, right? To say, this is a living thing, and like all living things, like human beings, it has flaws, and I love it anyway.
Was there a story that was particularly challenging for you to read?
The one that I maybe had the most fun reading is Annunciation, which is the last one. And that's primarily because in the summer, this past summer in San Francisco, there is an amazing troupe called Word for Word. And they actually, what they do is they have a show with actors, and they present your short story, every single word of it. Like the actors have to memorize every single word. And I sat in the audience watching them put on Annunciation and just wept like a little baby because it wasn't mine anymore in the best possible way, right? It's suddenly something that I could see in 3 dimensions outside of myself. And these actors were so extraordinary what they did. And it was just so moving. So when I was actually reading it in the sound system here, in the place where we were reading it, I was thinking often about the way that the actors invested some of the lines with humor that I hadn't intended, and maybe I stole a little bit from their reenactment.
Griselda sat down in one of the wrought iron chairs she had scattered there and asked me if I knew that she was the daughter of an industrialist in Germany. Very, very wealthy. Pins. Some kind of pin nobody else in the world could make. When she was a child, every Christmas Eve, after the department store in her town closed for the night, it would open just for her, little Princess Griselda, and she was allowed to run up and down the aisles and choose any toy she wanted. How magical it was in that empty store, with its sweet evergreen boughs and oranges and the smell of Feuer Zangenbowle in the air. I listened, thinking it was odd that when Griselda spoke, she seemed not to be telling a story, but rather to be reciting something that she had memorized verbatim. Perhaps, I told myself, she loved to tell stories to create a past she never had. And who was I, who had just erased my own past, to blame her for this?
Have you ever considered narrating any of your novels?
I have considered it, but to be perfectly frank, the novels require a voice other than mine. All of them do, right? And I think it's a good thing to have a voice that is closer to the voice of the novel in some ways, right? I mean, I think that with Brawler coming with a first person first story and last story, those first person stories really do have a lot of autofiction, I guess, in them. So I felt really like it was necessary. All my novels at this point, except for certain tiny bits of them, are in the third person, and they all have a different register, right? I mean, I think you could very easily pick up Fates and Furies and Matrix and think that they're from very different writers. So no, I love to hear what professional actors do because they are necessarily much more adept at reading books than I am. But I love to do it. I love, my messy voice in the story collections.
You wrote you became a writer because you were a swimmer, and I'm really intrigued by this, partly because I've just begun to swim in an organized way. Tell me more.
Well, I was a very serious swimmer when I was young. I loved it so much. And I think it's partially because I was a kid who was born without a whole lot of additional skin. I was just like, I feel everything all the time, no matter where I am. And suddenly I was given this beautiful, calm space of the pool every single day for 3 hours at a time, where I only had to really listen to my coach after every however many laps I was doing. But then I had this gorgeous free time to really just live in my thoughts as my animal body was moving. Right? I think it's two things. It's the physical repetition and the gorgeous rhythm of the body moving and sort of exhausting you to liberate the mind, to liberate the imagination. And, that's the time that I had the most peace in my life, was sort of staring at a lane line going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for hours every single day. That's when I could let my imagination sort of wander off, and when I could sort of replay the way that I felt that I had misplayed scenes from my day, or dream about the books that I was reading and dream them further along than I'd actually gotten. I mean, it really is formational for me that I became a writer because I had these moments in the pool that were very, very similar, weirdly, to the way that I work now in the morning, all alone in my room in the dark, right? It's really just massive amounts of imagination and solitude.
Well, you've written acclaimed novels and acclaimed short stories, and each form, to me, would seem to draw on different creative muscles. Do short stories begin differently for you than novels do?
You know, short stories and novels are radically different for me. A novel is a question so large or love so large that I know for a fact I will never be able to see the end of it. Not in the 5 years that I devote to it, not in ever, right? So it's a puzzle. It's a giant puzzle. And eventually it becomes an atmosphere that you walk around in day to day, and everything that you see and do and read and experience feeds the beautiful atmosphere of the novel. And I love that, right? I love having one or two at all times so that whatever I'm doing, if I'm walking the dog or cooking dinner, I'm in the novel. I'm thinking of the novel. But for me, a short story, I came out of poetry. I love poetry so much, and I really, really, really love formal poetry, believe it or not, because I love the way that it forces my thoughts to bend in a direction I didn't know I could bend them. And I also love architecture, and I actually think that the short story requires incredibly strong architecture. So for me, it's more of a feeling, it's like a brief flash, right? And an inspiration that I know now to not act on immediately. So I'll take whatever the muse has given me, whether it's, a character, a situation, even a place, right? What's the time Mr. Wolf came out of place? And I'll take that and put it into the sort of the spinning constellation of ideas in the back of my head, let the subconscious work on it for as long as it needs to, and there it'll grow gravity and density and weight and interest. And then one day, as I'm moving through the world and reading my books and watching whatever it is I'm watching, if I'm watching or talking to someone, that idea will collide with something that happens and becomes so urgent that the story falls over my eyes, and that's all I can see. I can't see the novels I'm working on, right? I can only see the story. And that's when I know that I have to at least write a draft. And I try to write them entirely in one go because I think the short story requires a channeling of energy that's a lot like surfing a wave into shore, right? You don't want to like chop it up. You want it to just go from beginning to end. That doesn't mean that my first drafts look anything like my final drafts. They don't at all in any way. But I do think what you're doing is sort of summoning energy. Yeah, they're just radically, radically different. Every time a story comes to me, it feels like a gift, right? Not that I don't have to work on it, but it's something that sort of descends to me. A novel is a lot of daily patience and love and thinking and work, which I also love, and I love equally. I love novels and short stories absolutely equally, but it's sort of a long game. It's a patient game as opposed to a flash of delight.
I'm wondering what writing this collection, these stories, allowed you to do that might not have been possible in a novel.
Oh, there's so much that I've been attempting, right? I do believe that writing is play. It's very intentional play, right? It's very serious play, but it's morally serious, but it's also deeply joyful in a way that I think we often don't think of work being, but work can be joyful, and it probably should be joyful. So when I sit down with a short story, I let it do whatever it wants to do, to be honest, right? I let it become its own person and follow the paths that it needs to follow. And the first few drafts are just wild and crazy. I would never even try to reread them because I don't have to, right? Because the story sort of building itself through trial and error. And eventually it sort of coheres and becomes something stronger, and it has layers to it that have slowly come to the surface as I'm working on it through the drafting process. I deeply, deeply love this story form. I find it so challenging and strange. And This is the other thing too. This is why AI will never be useful in the creation of literary fiction, because the creation of literary fiction is about the struggle, right? It's about the work. It's about figuring things out. It's about sitting with the problem until you have a flash of inspiration. It's about working and working and working, and then finally coming to a solution. It's about reconciling yourself with the work at hand. And AI shuts down all of those avenues, right? AI is about the product. AI is not about the process. The art is in the process.
Absolutely. Amen. At the end of the collection, you include authors' notes about the stories, which give readers, listeners a glimpse into how they came into being. What made you decide to include those reflections?
I found so much fun in that. So I got the unbelievable luck to be the guest editor of one year the Penn Henry Awards, and then the next year the Best American Short Stories. Right, this is sort of something that I dreamt of, but when I was just a little baby writer. In those anthologies, one of the great joys is the author's notes at the end, which are a way of the author summoning the reader over and standing over the story and pointing out, elements that they want to explain. And you feel a little bit as though you're being given a gift, an additional little gift by the author. And so I love this idea for any short story collection. I hadn't done it in my two previous ones, Delicate Edible Birds in Florida. But with this one, I thought maybe I'll do that. And maybe I'll make them a little cone-like, like a little like mysterious, right? So that they're joyfully engaging with the titration of closeness that writers always play with, right? The assumption of autobiography, but also at the same time, they do give a tiny little porthole into the story that perhaps the reader wouldn't have seen without the author's gentle guidance. So I just found it was fun.
They were so much fun to read, and they made me want to reread the book again.
Oh, good. That's so great.
Well, in the audiobook, you also narrate these notes. Did reading them aloud feel different to you from actually narrating the stories themselves?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I always think, it does feel like a little like I had given you a platter of food that I really, really cared about, and then I just sort of like garnished it with some pepper. It was the last step that is not totally necessary, but it was kind of like a way of looking you in the eye and saying, "Hey, thank you for reading my stories."
To Sunland. The spirits can never stop moving in Florida because the limestone bedrock beneath is too fragile. Tacachale, which used to be called Sunland, is a mile from my house. On eerie nights, solstices, harvest moons, the house becomes a boulder in a stream, splitting a current of stirred-up former Sunland spirits who are frantically looking for something. What exactly escapes them?
Listening to audiobooks is so intimate because your voice is literally in our ears. And so when you sort of step outside, you break that fourth wall, so to speak. It really is like I'm being spoken to directly.
Absolutely. I listen to so many audiobooks. I go for long, long walks and runs. And I just love to just sort of sink into an audiobook. And that's my favorite part of it, right? It's a person telling you a story. And what is more vestigial than that? Right? That is, before even books began as a technology, people were doing that around the fires, right? People were tucking their children in and telling them stories. And so it feels very, very atavistic, right? It's very fundamental to what being a human is.
Yeah, I agree. I love being told stories. And I do
Too.
the same thing. It's walking the dog, it's in the garden,
Yep.
when I'm cooking.
I do it often when I'm doing things that I don't want to do. It's a way to inspire me to do them.
Yeah.
Right? Cleaning, I listen to lots of audiobooks when I'm cleaning.
I would no more go to the gym without an audiobook than I would jump off a roof.
100%. I'm right there with you.
Well, we have to give a shout out to the Links, your independent bookstore in Gainesville that you and your husband run, and you also have a nonprofit component. So tell us about it and why this is so important for you.
Well, as you know, Florida is the number one state in terms of book bans. by far, by thousands upon thousands of titles. It's because Ron DeSantis back in 2023 decided to allow basically anyone who lived here to challenge books in public schools and public libraries. And that not only affected the books themselves, but it also inspired a culture of fear, which is deeply intentional. Authoritarianism relies on a culture of fear. And at the time, I had this amazing fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin. This book banning made international news because the Germans were not having it. They were not happy about it. And I, having lived in Florida for, 18 years by then, sort of rolled my eyes. And one of my friends, my editor, pulled me to the side and said, no, you have to take this seriously. Book banning and book burning are the way that modern genocides begin. You have to make a stand. You have to tell people about what's going on because it's very, very urgent. And he quoted Heinrich Heine, this beautiful 19th century poet, and he said, Dort wo man Bücher verbrennt, verbrennt man auch am Ende Menschen. In the places where one burns books, they will one day burn people. I got chills. And we came home and we decided to open the Lynx. My husband is from a bookstore family. They had one for over 50 years. And so we have a 2-track store. We have the for-profit store, which allows us to do a great deal in the state of Florida, which is very friendly to for-profit small businesses. And we have a nonprofit, which has, to this point, given away over $100,000 worth of banned and challenged books to Floridians, to populations that need them the most.
That's doing the Lord's work, Lauren. I really thank you for it.
Oh, thank you. We're having fun doing it too, which is part of the joy.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me your time. Thank you for all your writing. It really does give me such joy, and I sit with them for such a long time.
Oh, that makes me so happy to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. That was author Lauren Groff. We were talking about her collection of short stories, Brawler, which, because of her brilliant narration, is an Earphones Award winner. You've been listening to Behind the Mic with Kirkus Reviews. Behind the Mic drops on Thursdays, and if you follow us, we'll simply appear in your feed. And while you're at it, follow Fully Booked by Kirkus Reviews. Fully Booked is the perfect podcast for book lovers. Every Tuesday, host Megan Labrise brings you author interviews, industry insights, and recommendations from the bestseller list. Find your next great book on Fully Booked by Kirkus Reviews. You can follow Fully Booked and Behind the Mic on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. And then stop by kirkusreviews.com to check out reviews for both print and audiobooks. Behind the Mic is produced by Jessica Lockhart. Michelle Cobb, Stephen Cummings, Leslie Fine, Alan Minskoff, Alex Ritchie, Laura Rossi, and Kendra Winchester are our contributors. Jennifer Dell is our editor, with assistance from Alicia Langerman. Tom Beer is the executive producer. The music is William Ross Chernup's Nomads 4-Way. And I'm your host, Jo Reed. Good listening.